people who are on here, not quite all of them. If you are not familiar with DCC, we're the grassroots conservation organization that looks after things in Denali in its region. We talk about protecting the wildlife, wilderness, and way of life of Denali. And we, generally speaking, do a lot of work to keep members informed about what's going on in terms of policy and decisions about management at Denali. To some degree, the state and local decisions, land managers' decisions that are going on around the park as well. And we usually hold a few events like this one every year, topics of interest to us, and we hope to our members. If you're not already a member, go to DenaliCitizensCouncil.org, and there's a page right there where you can join up. Anyway, with that brief bit about DCC, I'm really happy, which most of you already know. I'm really happy to welcome Davyd Betchkal joining us this evening to talk about soundscapes. We haven't been talking about soundscapes a lot recently, but as those of you who've been around for a while know, the park has been monitoring soundscapes here for right around 20 years now, starting with the work of Shan Burson back in the early 2000s, I believe. And we've had another couple of sound technicians here, sound researchers, before Davyd joined the park in 2009. And he's been awesome to have here, and has done a lot of really interesting research, some of which he's going to share with us tonight. His work has actually expanded since he started at Denali. He now actually works all across the Alaska region. So he's not just finding out how noisy Denali is, but how noisy other places are too. And just also listening to sounds that have our biological and ecological interest. The Denali soundscape has been particularly important because in the Denali Backcountry Management Plan, one of the chief mechanisms for managing some kinds of use in the backcountry links back to how much noise is in different parts of the park. And the park's divided into regions, and each one has a set of indicators and standards for how noisy it should be before the Park Service takes action to protect the natural soundscape. And for that reason, the sound work here has been particularly important. And again, it's been really a while since DCC has gotten a really thorough update of exactly what the Park Service has been finding out in the last few years. We're really excited to hear what Davyd has to share. And Davyd, with that, I am going to let you take it over.
Well, thank you very much, Charlie. And thanks to everyone in the Denali Citizens Council for coming out tonight. And I wish I could see you all in person. It'd be more engaging, but I understand that many of you are kind of scattered across North America. So thanks for joining. And to those of you who may be joining outside of the Denali Citizens Council, thanks for coming as well. As Charlie said, my name is Davyd Halyn Betchkal. I'm a biologist and acoustician. I started here in Denali as a seasonal employee, but now, as Charlie says, I work all over the state. I'm part of our Park Service Natural Resources Stewardship and Science Directorate, and work with the Natural Sounds and Night Skies Division. The title of this talk is Public Tools, Public Research, which I'll get into a bit more of the meaning of the talk, but this is a spot up at what we call Cook's Escape, or Cook's Escape Pass, poised between the East Fork Glacier here and the Bull River. And it's on the route to get to one of our monitoring locations on the Bull River. So I also want to just take a moment to thank the hundreds of people who've helped out developing this knowledge over the last 2 decades. Charlie alluded to Shan Burson, who started this program. I was also preceded by Chad Holtz and Jared Withers here. I've been here for a little while now. I've been able to work with a lot of fantastic seasonal employees, though their time in transit through Denali varies in length. They're all really unique people, and they've brought a lot of unique perspectives to this program. Worked with a ton of rangers, ton of volunteers, all sorts of people who scientists and other people who've helped contribute ideas. And I suspect there are a few of you out there in the audience tonight, so thanks again. I think we all can appreciate that Denali is rich with tranquil, solitudinous landscapes. You know, this is a place that people come from all over the world to appreciate this kind of thing. I know I love this sort of experience of the mistiness or the mystery that can be afforded in a pass like this. However, you know, acoustic environments in Denali are also one of the resources that the park protects that's been most affected by human activities. I think without a doubt, you can say that noise is the most prevalent impact in Denali's backcountry. A lot of the folks who this floating bar to go away. Let's see.
Oh, it's showing up fine here, I think.
Okay, very good. I guess it's just for me. Sorry about that. Okay, so the folks who've kind of framed the backcountry management plan relied on some research in a book called Wilderness Management by Hendy and Dawson. And they kind of framed these tiers of experiences in the park. You know, you can enjoy outdoor activities anywhere. You can go jogging, for instance. But some activities like fishing or maybe even flight seeing are wilderness enhanced, okay? Like a wilderness setting improves that experience because there's beautiful things to look at or whatnot. But really, the core idea of a place like this is to protect wilderness-dependent activities, such as experiencing solitude and isolation or observing natural ecological processes. Both of these are fundamentally part of the experience of enjoying the sound resources. You know, they both lend themselves to experiencing solitude and isolation and are symbolic of that spatially. But also, I mean, sounds in their own right are interesting natural ecological processes that are beautiful to experience. This is a pretty neat, not everyone's into mathy kind of stuff, but I'm a mathematician, you know, by nature. So it's, or at least an applied mathematician. This is a really neat paper by Kathleen Dannemiller, where she was talking about what does it take for change to occur? So her formula for change was that essentially the magnitude of this term here, that a dissatisfaction with how things are now multiplied for a vision of the future, it's palpable, and some concrete first steps, how practical those are. The magnitude of this term must be greater than whatever the human resistance is to change or practical resistance. Of course, one of the reasons I stumbled there is that sound, unlike many environmental contaminants, leaves no residue. All we need to do is change human behavior, and we instantaneously can restore acoustic environments. So the backcountry management plan also lists out on page 47 a bunch of different access management tools. Primarily, we're concerned with transportation noise in the backcountry. And the corrective actions the park has already tried here are basically, these are in tiered order, sort of increasing magnitude. I think anyone can kind of just scanning these can see that. But we've already tried a lot of education and outreach activities. There hasn't been much enforcement of existing regulations. That's something we could potentially explore. The park, notably, and I'm going to be talking at length about this later on in the talk, has applied what I think is kind of a tricky term here, voluntary restrictions. We've been calling them voluntary best practices, but same idea. And the park has also explored some required registration for things related to noise. The phase we're currently in, and I'm going to get a little bit more, in depth about the effectiveness of some of these later. But right now we're exploring the use of technology requirements related to access and managing commercial activity. One thing that we want to avoid is one of the archetypes of mismanagement, drifting goals. This book is fantastic. My job is to basically go out and diagnose systems, complex systems, you name it, and try to figure out how they work. I'm literally an auditor. So, essentially, this drifting goals archetype, you have two ways. If you have a gap between the what you want to achieve and the actual condition, you can lower the goal, which will allow you to close the gap. But essentially, that's destructive. It's better to take a corrective action. A lot of my work day to day is not involved with corrective actions because as I'm no longer a park employee. I work basically as a consultant with parks. A lot of my day-to-day work is actually in this area, determining what the actual conditions of acoustic environments are in Denali. And, this next section, I'd like to just give you a basic idea of how to measure and monitor sound. So here's hope some other people really like to spend time around flowing water. It's something that has really attracted my attention for years. I love it. This is a photograph from Cache Creek. So a lot of this granite is the same stuff that makes up the pluton of the Denali Massif. It's beautiful. The clear water and this sort of light colored rock is really fantastic to photograph. It's an immersive environment. You're hearing all these little bubbles, all these little splashing droplets of water, pouring water, the opening and closing of cavities underneath rocks. Fantastic and complex sound environment. It's also a term we use in the literature and to describe the geographic size that surrounds your ears, the area you can interact with. We call that active space. So for a given type of sound, say like a white-crowned sparrow or a fox sparrow, you have a certain active space that you're interacting with that. And in an environment like this, your active space might be quite small indeed. Another example of this is if you're in a car, sometimes it's difficult to communicate with the driver of the vehicle when you're in the back seat, especially if you're in like a big van or something. So even over a distance of a few meters, you can no longer communicate because your active space is very small. If you move up onto the hillside, I think we all know intuitively that our active space increases and you essentially interact with a much larger space. This contrast of active space, the contrast of ambience to what you're actually listening to is deeply and intimately connected to the idea of monitoring sound, because essentially it's the primary principle at play. So all animals experience sounds embedded in ambience. It's inextricable to our experience, and we're unified as animals. This is something that we can't avoid. Essentially, what I'm showing here is this software tool I wrote called Acoustic Record, and it helps us sort of demonstrate what we might go out and detect or whatnot. It's a scoping tool for me. I'm not going to get into a lot of details right now on it, but the point of this slide is rather to show that as ambience changes, we might have an inversion at night and then well-mixed atmospheric conditions in the daytime. It might change, and these are essentially the same length and intensity of what like an aircraft event might be. So you can see that they're relatively short duration and change at much shorter timeframes than ambience does, and they're considerably more intense than natural ambience. Although there are some events which we just barely detect. They only just they graze your active space geographically, and those might easily be obscured if ambience changes. So again, this is kind of a conceptual level. No need to understand this on a numeric level. Let's talk a little bit about ambient level and about what typical levels are like in Denali. So in Cache Creek, standing in a creek crossings, all that kind of good stuff, you're talking about an ambient level between 50 and 55 dB. And I know when I was standing in the creek that it was really hard for me to hear my colleagues at camp a few meters away. In fact, speech interference is a common level the Park Service uses to evaluate impacts at 52 dB. Speech is interfered with it at 1 meter. Up on the hill right above Cache Creek here, I could easily hear a marmot on this far ridge with the talus. These kinds of environments where you're proximal to flowing water like this are usually 35 to 30 to 35 dB. And the active space correspondingly increases a great deal. So a little change of scene here. This is looking down from the Sushanna Ridge near our Sushanna Ridge monitoring station, looking out over the Teclanica River Valley and the Sanctuary Valley beyond. A little glimpse of the Park Road down here to give you a sense of scale. And up here, far from flowing water, environments in Denali, which is most of the land area of the park, is typified by levels between 20 and 25 dB. I want to also throw out that I was recently invited to give a talk for the Acoustical Society of America that was on the topic of this particular standard I'm listing here, this methods to define and measure residual sound in protected natural and quiet residential areas. It's really important to us. The Park Service had some contribution in its development, around 2010. And essentially, this standard is important because it's a clean break from some of the ways that this field originated in community noise. It recognizes that natural environments have different, they're different from cities. The background is natural, not noise. And so in the course of presenting on this standard to other acousticians, one of the things that I was mentioning, I went back through and looked at 570 measurements across the national park system. And I found that 20 dB was the median sound level in the entire system, which is pretty different than what most people say. So that's something to be aware of. And when people say that a natural environment is some sound level, a good rule of thumb would be to start with 20. But it keeps going from there. Even more grand, we just came out of the winter months. I can hear the water dripping. I got the window open in my office. I can hear the water dripping, but in the deep cold, -35, in the deep snow, sound levels in the park become extraordinarily quiet, around 10 dB. And you can essentially, at 20 dB, you might be, it's familiar that we're limited by, terrain in how far we can hear. But at 10 dB, you're limited by your ears. You can no longer hear levels much lower than this. 0 dB is the threshold of human hearing, but at 10 dB, you're already starting to get pretty limited. At least people like me who have some hearing damage are starting to get limited. This is a beautiful photo from a former naturalist here. Oh, and I wanted to point out, so what I've avoided saying thus far is that all of these have some specific measure related to them. This is, I'm going to talk a little bit about when you're reading a plan or looking at a plan. This is sort of my civic education. You can tune out if you don't read a lot of plans, but if you're reading a plan and you want to understand more about these measures, here's basically what they mean. Pretty much every plan and every measurement you're ever going to see of sound is an equivalent sound level, an acoustic time average. It's better if a plan includes the integration time. In the Park Service, almost all our measurements are 1 second in duration, which helps us separate out that ambience from other transient noise events or bird songs or whatnot. It helps us separate the two, and we can talk about natural ambience, the background, or something else. Better yet would be to include the frequency band of interest. In this case, you could have a single band like 80 hertz, or like we usually are referring to, and I'll be referring to in this talk quite a bit, talking about the range of human hearing from about 12.5 to 20,000 hertz. This is a typical measurement for the Park Service. I don't think the sound is going to play, so but basically this is a clip. I'm going to shut up for a second, so in case you do hear it, this is a sound I synthesized. It's created for me to show and demonstrate that sound and audio recordings can be very information rich.
Yeah, seeing it but not hearing it.
Darn. Oh well, we're gonna. It's like a tinkling sound, rats. It's sort of a gimmick, anyways. But essentially, you've been robbed of this experience. But the short story here is that you can listen to the sound that would have carried a lot of information about the outline of the state of Alaska. And just like you could measure the distance from the Aleutian Islands to southeast, or get the area of the state, you can do those same things with sound. I'm not sure what those would mean in terms of sound, but there's similar measures. And I'm going to talk a little bit about how we extract information from audio recordings. Okay. And what you just saw was this called a spectrogram. Spectrograms have 3 dimensions. They have a time axis here. And this is in seconds. They have a frequency axis, like I said, from 12.5 to 20,000 hertz. The range of human hearing is relevant to us, but incidentally, that's also the range for most terrestrial mammals and birds, frogs. And then they have a brightness, and in this case, this is a perceptually uniform color scheme, and so you can actually, whether you have good color vision or not, the values should all be correspond to energy. So how much energy each. And so I'm going to break that through, walk that through. But first, what are we looking at a little bit here? We've got some birds singing up in the high frequencies. That makes sense. They're high-pitched sounds. We've got some transient gusts of wind that kind of come and go throughout this. We've got the sound of the Teklanika River, which is a constant and slowly changing form of ambience. And we have this propeller aircraft noise event, which is the primary focus of much of my work. Over the course of my career, my team and I have annotated 200,000 noise events, aircraft, snow machines, you name it, but mostly aircraft. And I myself have annotated over 165,000 of these. So you get really good at reading spectrogram. In this case, what I'm indicating here between these dashed lines is the duration of the event. In the dimensions of time, it's about 155 seconds long. You might look at one of the morphological features of this aircraft noise event is its propeller tone. It's a small single engine propeller aircraft, and the tone is about 80 hertz, as you can see here. That's the dimensions of frequency again. And finally, you might ask, at maximum, how energetic was the propeller event? And you look for the brightest spot, and you're like, okay, it's about 75, and that's the dimensions of energy. Another way of saying the same thing is, in order to get that value, you had to say, okay, over the course of 1 second, this the resolution of the spectrogram in this direction, and at that frequency of 80 hertz, the maximum sound pressure energy was 75. And again, you still get the same energy result, but you've had to sort of select in terms of time and frequency in order to get that value. This is something I'm not going to delve into a lot, but for when I'm training people on how to read spectrograms and understand results, this is something we spend a lot of time on. How are you actually defining and collapsing those two things? So hopefully that discussion about LEQ is also helpful to sort of get a sense of this is somewhat nuanced because you're dealing with a lot of information. You got to kind of pare it down. Okay, so now let's look at some results. This is 2 spectrograms that come from the same year, same month, same day, same hour. It's from the July 4th of 2014 at the 12 o'clock hour, and 2 different spots in the park. Down here in the southwest corner of the park. And over here, so the Andean Glacier and the Rift Glacier, they're 2 glacial environments. They both have a sound, ambient sound level of around 30 dB. It's a lot of flowing water and wind, so they're pretty similar. But I hope that it's really apparent that you can see that we've annotated many aircraft overflights over the course of this. And they're made up of multiple different aircraft. But essentially, that's the gist of it. Like noise continues here, it stops. There's a moment of a short noise free interval here, and then noise continues, etc. And this is the gaps. We're talking like a median of maybe 4 minutes. We're just looking at 1 hour here, but we look at the entire duration of the record, and I hope it should be obvious that these sorts of things extend quite a bit over the course of if you're going to look at an entire event, these same patterns hold. All right, and so understanding patterns in terms of the processes that produce them is the essence of science and the key to the development of principles for management. This is a profound lecture. If you're interested in landscape ecology in general, I really recommend. This is one of my favorite papers ever. It's fantastic. This is during an award. Basically, this researcher, Sam Lone, was getting presented with an award, and it's a fantastic lecture. It's profound. But no less to underscore here that, for management, we understand these things in terms of cause and effect. Okay. And I want to go, before I proceed here, to many people, this can feel like this should be a little provocative, right? Because as Alaskans, we use aircraft a lot, and we recognize them as powerful tools. I myself recognize them as powerful tools. Culturally, I feel like it's important that we dispel some of the cowboy mythology that's associated with aircraft. And I'm going to not be speaking much about that, but it's something that I am concerned with a little bit. Aircraft are powerful, and thus they have portion of the expansive noise impacts. This Pratt & Whitney radial engine we're looking at here has a overall power of about 220 to 340 kilowatts. That's not quite as powerful as a semi-tractor at 450 kilowatts, but it's really powerful. This is essentially like heavy equipment of the sky, which makes sense because you're lifting a massive object and a bunch of human beings off the ground. That's obvious and almost trite to say, but I just wanted to reiterate that the scale at which these impacts are happening. Okay, this was some great research around the time the Backcountry Management Plan was released by Amanda Peacock. She got on board a bunch of aircraft and took some GPS tracks. And she found that if you simulated the way that sound spreads out from those routes into the park and intersected with the ground, that areas over 25 dBA, which I've already kind of asserted is much of the land area of Denali, would be, these 12 aircraft would influence or be audible essentially over about half the park area. It's an interesting result. So we've been really fortunate. And so one of the things I'm going to spend quite a bit of time talking about this in this presentation is flight tracks. We have recently, thanks to Dave Shirakawa and others, we've had access to tracks submitted from every administrative and every concessionaire operation over the park, at least for the most part. And this cause and effect, this is essentially the cause of noise in the park. And you can imagine how powerful this is for my research. I've been spending quite a bit of time applying this. And so what we're looking at here is just a time balance composite over the course of a few years. This kind of, I've been calling this like a sky roadmap. It's an intangible artifact because on any given day, you can't go out there and see it. And you can't hear it as a single individual sitting in place. It's too big for one person to hear. You'd have to sit for a long time in order to experience it, but it's still there. It's intangible. It's something that people get up, a few individuals who run these companies and the people in the Park Service who are managing these aircraft wake up every day and they perpetuate this thing into a consistent and rather persistent form. This is also a really interesting essay, but I'm not going to go on about it. Okay. These are the 2 points we were looking at before. So the Yentna Glacier and the Ruth Glacier. I hope now it's apparent that the cause of the reason that they're so different is the fact that, the Ruth is right on this route in between Talkeetna and the mountain. And by comparison, the Yentna is not. And in fact, I'm going to highlight a little bit later that this West Central area is really a special, important area it's a quiet refugia in the park system. Again, I'm going to be glancing off the idea of aviation best practices. I've already alluded to them. This is probably the one that was the most substantial of that effort. It's what we call maybe the Northside best practice. It's a small 2 to 4 kilometer wide area around the spine of the Alaska Range. And I hope people can see that, in fact, it does appear like there's some reason to believe that the practice has been effective in just dispersing flights, at least throughout that area, if not completely excluding them. Another thing I've been experimenting a lot with, and I'm part of a nationwide team that's working on this project, the Park Service has developed an inexpensive data logger for the FAA's automated dependent surveillance broadcast, which is a public broadcast, a radio signal that aircraft are required to transmit in the lower 48 and parts of Alaska and Hawaii, really only a very small part of Alaska indeed. But we've been experimenting. The folks down at Denali State Park have been really gracious in letting me deploy a logger down there, which lets us look up into the range. But we're going to be experimenting with some of those here on the north side of the range this summer. What we're looking at in this plot is the minimum detectable altitude. So basically you can see that the Dakotas and other terrain features are essentially creating shadows, radio shadows to the Kasugi Ridge. I've said there. Okay, as Charlie alluded to, the soundscape standards. These were the first quantitative standards in any Park Service plan. Though I was not involved, I started in 2009. I'm really proud of these. They're in some ways, a lot of people focus on the fact that they're flawed, but to me, I think they captured, not a moment too soon, the ideas of, this place was like before the 1990s, perhaps. And I don't know, I'm probably a little saying that clumsily because, again, I wasn't involved with this, but I do think that they did a really nice job capturing this. There's 3 standards, and they vary by zone. I'm not going to go into these super in detail. I encourage you, if you want to dig into the details, you should read the plan or the synoptic version of the plan. But basically, the first one has to do with the extent of noise in time. Yeah, the percentage of any hour that motorized noise is audible. And it spans from 5% or about 3 minutes or 3 minutes per hour to 50% or a half an hour. So gets to be quite a bit. The number of events per day over natural ambient level, I really love how intentional this was, but essentially I've already demonstrated in this talk that the only aircraft we can detect are over the natural ambient level. So it's just an account of the number per day. And it spans from 1 to 50. Maximum motorized level. One of the reasons I emphasized in my spectrogram example was exactly this. What is the maximum motorized level? And so essentially it is the single brightest column of one of those spectrograms. And there's 2 breakpoints, 40 dB in the low and medium zones and 60 dB in these high and very high zones. Let those kind of sink in. Okay, here we go. I think people have spent a lot of time discussing these maps, and this is the result of a park-wide inventory, a project that was funded starting in 2006, and I completed in 2015. So it just gives you a sense of the scale of this work. I mean, the privilege of being able to see so much of the park during the course of this project was remarkable. And I don't know, I'm still processing what that means in terms of my responsibility as an employee. But basically, this is the percent time audible standard. And what we're looking at here is the percentage of hours that exceed the standard in their different zone. I'm going to cover the zones again one more time. And the bold lines here is the low zone. The low zone involves the designated wilderness area of Denali, so that right here, and also the preserves. So I've just kind of lumped them together into one big low zone. Then everything else is in the medium zone. So up here in the Kantishna Hills, the Tech Thumb, the Toklat Basin, all that stuff, all this stuff down here. So like the Kahiltna and, these, the Eldridge and stuff, even up here in Camel. It's all medium, except there's also the Dunkel Hills, which is carved out as high, and this kind of core area in, this south central area of Denali. And this double hatched region is the very high zone, which is the Ruth Toklat corridor. Okay, so again, this is the percentage of any hour that exceeds the respective standard. And you can see the mountain itself as a destination concentrates aircraft. I think we saw that before in the diagram that showed the flight tracks, and you can see exceedance is greater in that area where traffic is concentrated. It's also quite a bit higher here on the eastern end of the park, but otherwise, not egregious. By comparison, okay, so this is actually new information for folks in DCC, I believe. So this is related to a bunch of different, these are designators we use for different areas in the park. I'm going to kind of talk about them briefly, but I would encourage you to follow up if you have questions about this part. And then we can talk about it during the discussion section. There's too much to cover quickly here. Basically, though, it shows through time. So now we're looking 2000s here, 2020s here. I haven't updated it recently. Apologies for that. But essentially, these voluntary best practices we discussed before, they only were really put into effect over a very short period of time between 2009 and 2012. And so you can see roughly that some of these have some effects. What I'm going to do here is, so each one of these stars represents when a best practice went into effect that we thought should have had an influence over the exceedance. For percentile audible, and so part of the reason of these slides is also to show how persistent were the effects, of that best practice. Did they last through time? Were they persistent, or did they kind of erode back into the state it was in before? And for this percentile audible standard, the one that's really notable here is that north side best practice. It didn't really change upper West Branch Toklat that much, but it somehow, or for some reason, it did improve compliance around Cathedral Mountain. So this is the events per day standard. I admire the 1 event per day standard, and in some places of the park, it's typical. Like the fact that essentially half of the time here at High Power Creek, you have 1 event, and half or less, and half of the time you have more. That means that the average is less than 1 per day here. It's a profound area of the park. It's extremely quiet and rich with solitude. Floating the Heron River or something. I know a few people did a trip years ago where we floated down here, and I mean, it's a great place to explore if you're looking for quietude. And likewise, there are other parts of the park too. Then I think actually this area around the Kantishna Hills, I'm going to talk about that in between kind of the Kantishna Hills and the outer range, is also really quiet and more accessible. But otherwise, compliance in the low zone is poor. Compliance, I want to point out that there are areas in the very high zone that have a high level of non-compliance with this standard. So 50 events per day, half of the days at Backside Lake are more than that. And I'm going to talk more about this area down in the southern part of the park on some site-based things, but okay. So here we're looking at monitoring. Again, Cathedral saw some important changes, but they were short-lived. Essentially, there was a 20% reduction in exceedance of the standard. And likewise, Upper West Branch Tolka also saw a reduction in the number of events with the north side best practice. But again, there was some erosion with that over time. See, I don't think these ones are so far apart. I seldom have things to say about them. It makes me very skeptical as a scientist. But I wanted to point out too that the Tohoku has been one of our longest running records. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that later, but essentially, it has had an interesting trajectory in terms of each of these metrics, and I hope to continue monitoring there in the long term. Okay, the last standard is the number of events exceeding a certain maximum sound level. This one is more varied. Ambience plays a big role here, and so it actually makes it a weaker standard in some ways. But again, this area right here on the Ruth has quite a bit of exceedance because it's a portal. I think that's one I'm going to talk about later, so I'm going to call that out. And some of these areas in the central area of the park exceed 40 dB quite a lot, partly because a lot of these have some pretty energetic ambience. But I did want to point out that the Cahill in the Pass best practice, which involved changing the way that people climb. A lot of times people will take off from base camp and climb up and sort of circle. And people will also, there was also another one that increased the orbiting radius around the mountain itself. That was one of the most effective best practices that I've seen. And it had a big reduction, about 20% reduction, and that has been persistent through time. And likewise, it looks like there's been, along with a reduction in the number of events and the percent time audible at Cathedral, was also just a reduction in the number of loud events. So otherwise, not too much work. Hopefully people are hanging in there. It's a lot of data. This is like my bread and butter. I do this every day. So some people might not have the same endurance for numbers, and I apologize if you're getting overwhelmed, but just try to clue into what you're interested in. Okay, so Triple Lakes Trail is sort of the complement to the Tohoku. Now, we've been sampling there for quite a long time. My second day on the job, as a matter of fact, was deploying this instrument. And long story short is it was the only one that we put out during the pandemic. Earlier, I alluded to a metric called noise free interval. It's the time when noise stops, you get some reprieve. It's your chance to experience and enjoy natural acoustic environments. And it's also the chance for wildlife and human beings to recover from the effects of noise. Noise free intervals are really important, and they're experiential. They're one of my favorite metrics, and I'm choosing to demonstrate it here because they also show this really important pattern, which relates the number of events to their magnitude, or the length of a noise free interval in hours. In some places in Denali, you can enjoy noise free intervals that last, typically over 10 hours. And in some places of Gates of the Arctic and Noatak, they're more like 40 hours. But here at the kind of on the east end of the park, there's quite a bit of air traffic. It's a congested area. Both folks come in north and south from Anchorage to Fairbanks, but also then, our routine commercial air traffic and Park Service operations. But during the pandemic, we realized that there was about a halving of the number of events per day, and that increased as we expected along this line. We're going to be monitoring at Triple Lakes every year until 2026. Okay, Kantishna. I think Dave alluded to this on the call, the folks who were just on the larger park call. Dave alluded to the idea that we monitored out in Kantishna, put an instrument out there in 2015, and we went back again last summer. Slightly different locations, but they have no real effect on this result. But basically, we also put cameras out just to kind of show you, for folks who haven't spent a lot of time in Kantishna. Right, this strip used to be, my understanding is it used to be in the days that there were miners out there, it was like a super cub strip. But now it's been really expanded and it's heavily maintained for commercial operations. But these cameras, I have no data from them, they got tampered with. Long story short here is that in 2015, we saw the crystallized operations of Kantishna Air Taxi. In the mid-morning, there was a quick turnaround of landing and then takeoff. And then there's alternating operations, landings, takeoffs, landings, takeoffs, landings, that took place throughout the rest of the day. It's pretty clear. And there's a fairly large number of events in each hour. By comparison, what I noticed in 2022 was a much more scrappy operation. The total number of propeller takeoffs and landings was halved, and their timing was almost always that quick turnaround, takeoff and landing, takeoff, landing, takeoff, landing, takeoff. And there was also an addition to some helicopter use on the airstrip. That always took place between about noon and 1. But by comparison, I would say that this is sort of a, what's the word? Trying to figure things out sort of scenario. Okay, let's talk about one of the other airstrips in the park, I should say. So the multimodal transportation noise in Denali's front country. We've monitored it in a number of places in the front country, at the McKinley National Park Airport, as pictured here in 2014. And also visitor center here. You can kind of spot the visitor center in just that corner of that picture. But a lot of other places in the front country too. The reason I'm mentioning the front country is that we were working circa 2017 with a researcher, Dr. Lauren Ferguson. Her PhD dissertation involved work on noise from the airstrip that was going to hinge into a management decision about commercial operations there. And the long story short is that it was recently accepted for publication in Applied Acoustics. I'm one of the co-authors on it. Basically, one of the things I'm really proud of in my contribution to this paper was to help organize all these different data. And the result was to create a map of visitor acceptability of noise, which helps interpret some of the things. Not everyone's an acoustician or wants to deal with noise metrics, but most people can understand what like acceptable or unacceptable means. To do this, to make this map of acceptability, I'm going to just trace this. If you're interested, I'll be happy to share this. I'm going to be sharing this, and hopefully it's going to be open access too. But basically, we made some measurements, like I've already alluded to, in the front country. Clip out actual sounds and noise, takeoffs, turnout, and overflights. Have visitors listen to them. Decide what they have to say about it in terms of acceptability, and develop a cumulative link mix model, which essentially is a fancy way of saying, how does the acceptability decrease with noise level? At the same time, we are getting some of our earliest flight tracks, and I use those to typify routes in and out, both with a northbound takeoff when the wind's coming from the north, and a southbound takeoff when it's coming from the south. And I simulated the noise footprint on the ground. That's the important linkage. Is that, and then you calibrate it using the recordings that you already made. So you get kind of a nice map of what the noise levels of takeoff would actually look like. And then finally, you use, because you have the sound level at each place on the earth, and you have the acceptability at each sound level, you can convert from sound level on the ground to acceptability on the ground. It looks like this. So the scale here is from -4 to +4, as social scientists love to do. They love these like kind of discrete integer scales, but basically most of the front country area noise, the noise from takeoffs from this airstrip is unacceptable. As people kind of head up onto Mount Healy, it becomes more acceptable, but almost nowhere is it considered acceptable. Okay. So another airstrip, monitoring the Ruth Amphitheater. This one is more complicated, right? Because one, we have an inholder there who operates the Sheldon Chalet, and then there are climate change interactions in this area where we've been getting increasing reports that essentially the late season operations on this strip are degrading. So I've got a report that Nancy's going to share with everyone at the end, but that's basically about this very topic. So I've been monitoring there, started in 2016. We went back there in 2021. I actually don't have the results from 21 processed yet, but basically this is a very busy slide. And if you're interested in digging into the Ruth Amphitheater, the report's got a lot of great information, including some of Joe Van Horn's work from back in 1999, stuff like that. But what I noticed was that for the most part, aviation noise is pretty stable. There's a small increase in noise from helicopters, but a lot of the change, this bump in noise level, was actually due to generators, construction, and stereos from the chalet. It's not due to aircraft changes. And in fact, the noise free interval, the same reason that a lot of stuff dropped, is for that same reason. But these, yeah, we're continuing to monitor in that area. One of the salient results, I think, from that area is we have counts of the landings, and you can see right around mid-May is when a lot of visitors start to arrive in Alaska, and there's a big increase in the number of landings. Typical on a good day, you can see there's some bad weather days where there's not many landings or any at all. Excuse me. But a typical day is maybe about 20 events, 20 landings. And in peak season, mid-July-ish, there's as many as 30 in a day. This is the audible duration of noise in hours, which this result, I look at this stuff all the time. It really is profound to me that the typical amount of noise in a day at the Ruth Amphitheater is 8 hours at maximum in the peak season. And what we notice here, though, is that although the landings dropped off, this is 2019 data, the landings drop off in mid-August. The green here is noise. Noise it also drops off, but not as much. So people are still utilizing that airspace for tours. They're just not landing. They may be going over to the base camp or something like that, but noise persists. So one of the unfortunate consequences of this result is that essentially changing landings is not going to solve the noise problem entirely. It will reduce the intensity of noise and its extent, but yeah. Okay. Getting there, folks. One of the things that I've been spending a lot of time during the pandemic, my fieldwork really dropped off a lot, and I redoubled down on a lot of my theoretical work and how to make better, more effective best practices, how to research and understand monitoring. And one of the core things that I've been mentioning throughout this whole talk is active space. How far away can you hear a given sound source, especially aircraft? And so I finally think I've got a good way of making quantitative active spaces. This is a novel contribution to the literature. No one else has something that does this. The Park Service tried to do something like it earlier in the 90s, but that software is gone. No one knows where it is. I think it's some private sector company probably has it somewhere. And anyways, I'm not even sure it runs anymore. But long story short, is we went through these tracks. We got the mic at Ruth, and we went through. We did this for a bunch of different sites, but I'm using Ruth as my example. And we end up binarizing them into audible and inaudible points using physical theory and simulating the propagation of sound from each of these points. You can guess, where would aircraft be audible if they were, if you say an aircraft flew this way, like that. If it was inside of this black line, it would be audible. That's our best guess anyways. And so I've been working on these. We expect to publish this as well. And so I hope this is a tool that we can use anywhere in the National Park Service, but especially here in Denali to help develop better best practices. Now, this tool also works in 3D. So this is a 3D example of what the Ruth Amphitheater's active space might actually look like. You can see it's extensive. This is like a 20-kilometer radius here. I alluded to the Tola-Tokositna. It's one of our longest records in the National Park Service, and it's kind of right here on the floodplain of the Tokositna River. And this is the actual terminal moraine we're looking at, kind of spanning this direction. The site is up here, and again, this is the terminal moraine. This is a big feature, big hydraulic feature, where the Tokositna River punches through the terminal moraine. It's energetic, and it's what sets the ambience. This point of this slide is about developments in our monitoring technology. So one of the things that has been limiting us for a long time is the ability of instruments, like basically, an instrument like this that I use to measure sound. It's called a sound level meter, and they're designed to work in cities, not in parks. So in the past, up until about pre-2009, the quietest an instrument like this could measure was 20 dB. And as I've already said, that's pretty insufficient to document ambience. Most of my career, we've been able to measure down to about 14 dB. And the point of the slide is that it tells Tokositna before that hydraulic feature, before the river breaks up and that hydraulic feature kicks in, we were limited by the noise floor, for sure. And this record from 2005, we were limited by the noise floor, for sure, in this record from 2010. And nowadays, I have instruments that can go down to 5.5. So that's pretty neat. And it means that I think, for the most part, we can capture ambience anywhere we put a mic. It's neat to see that these processes are also pretty consistent throughout years ecologically. But I'm interested in monitoring the way that flowing water changes, because there are obvious climate change ramifications to that too, in terms of how far you can hear. And also just it's interesting to understand rivers. Here's the active space for the Tokositna. Again, it's like a 10-kilometer, despite it, the sound levels here, we're talking about like in the summer, about 42 dB. So it's really energetic. But you could still hear about 10K away, 10 kilometers. Okay. One thing I want to bring to people's attention that may have slipped past you, Denali published a long-range transportation plan, and I contributed an appendix to that. It's kind of based on our management by objectives framework. The long story short about this is why I'm so excited about it, and I've saved it the best for last, is that I think it demonstrates how we could make better best practices. Basically, we were talking about resistances to noise. I'm flipping that around. It's sort of inverting this. And where do you not want noise to be? There's a lot of different rationales that you can use for where you might not want noise to be. Then you can treat aircraft like electrons. You put an anode somewhere where there's a portal, an origin of aircraft, and you put a cathode where there's a destination, mainly the mountain. But long story short is you could do this between front country airstrip and Kantishna, whatever you like. And essentially then using this spatial values, which is you're using an expert panel. Maybe it's the public, maybe it's members of the academic community. I don't know who the experts would be necessarily, but essentially you'd come up with this rationale. You'd use the circuit flow analysis, which is used for all sorts of things in other natural resources like caribou migration and things like that. And then you'd go back, you'd implement the best practice, and you'd monitor. And if it worked, great. And if it didn't work, you'd feedback. And hopefully I've made it clear that that's where we really need to put time and energy in the next few years. This is what that kind of looks like. So again, these aircraft things are all these anodes, and then this is the cathode in this case. This is just my resistance rationale that I came up with based on a number of different factors. It has no real management significance at all. This is a strategic plan. It doesn't have any, NEPA significance at all. But this area right here, south of the Park Road, I really think it's important that Denali focus on that, because so many people want to have an accessible, quiet experience. And that could do so much, like to expand the existing Northside best practice that a lot of people put a lot of time and a lot of deliberation into, and making that more robust, whatever that looks like. Revisiting that idea would just be really powerful, and I think it would change a lot of people's lives. So I hope that this kind of design considerations are become more consistently part of our management practices as we look towards the future.
Oh, terrific, David. Thank you. It leaves me with a million, even though you covered an incredible amount of ground, it leaves me with a million questions. But what I'm going to invite everyone to do now, if you wish, is to either raise your hand on the good question if I even know how to raise your hand, but there's a and Nancy, maybe you can jump in and help me out here, but I believe there's a way that as a participant you can indicate to the system you want to raise your hand, but you can also just type a question in the chat and we would be happy to read it for you. And you can find that chat bar just down at the bottom of your screen, the chat bubble. Click on the chat bubble. But there's one thing that occurs to me. So you mentioned that Denali's soundscape standards were the first, which I kind of knew back at the time we were working on them. Who has anyone done anything similar at other parks since? And without going into too much detail, because I want other people mostly to have a chance to ask questions. You know, is there some other different kind of metric that they've chosen to work with other than the ones that we've used?
Thank you so much for asking that question, Charlie. It's a great question. Shortly after the Denali plan in 2010, Zion published a soundscape management plan, and they used several metrics. One of them was listening area reduction, which has to do with that active space size changing. I'm not sure what I think about that metric exactly, but and I don't know much about the Zion plan, if I'm being honest, so I'm going to keep it at that. Recently, the Glacier Bay Marine Management Plan, EA, used noise-free interval as a metric, and I was involved in helping advocate for that. So I'm really excited about that plan. We anticipate that the Katmai Backcountry Management Plan may also include noise standards. So hopefully the Alaskan parks are kind of all getting the picture that this is a rare and precious thing that, you know, this action, though it seems futile sometimes here in Denali, it's helping keep us attuned to this issue and helping us manage this resource in the long term. Great question.
Cool. Thanks. I'm surprised that there's not a longer list actually because it's been, you know, almost 20 years since we worked on those standards at Denali. I think that Nancy had her hand up next, and then I'll go to a couple of the questions in the chat. And someone did point out Scott pointed out to me that the raise your hand feature is under the reactions tab there at the bottom of, for me, at the bottom of my screen. I'm not sure what it looks like on everyone's phones. Nancy, do you want to unmute and ask your question?
Yes, Charlie, thank you. And thank you, David, very much. And if people want to see your full face, you can close up your slides and then your face will appear on the screen. Your choice, David.
I'm tempted to leave the slides up, Nancy, because people may have specific
you might
questions.
want to go back. Okay, yeah, great. I remember some of these from DCC managing the comments for our members on the backcountry plan. So especially the Amanda Peacock slide, where it was really pretty definitive to see the noise pressure from the aircraft corridors, and it helped us to develop later on those mitigations that you talked about. So I'm glad that some of them at least worked. As you know, it's really difficult to translate a science verified need with a public policy act, because of course this is all in sound space that's not controlled by the Park Service. So you need to get voluntary compliance from the FAA and various and sundry. But I was just raising my hand to let people know to go down to the reactions button to raise their hand if they wanted to talk. And that was all I had to say. But thank you very much, David. Great. It's so great to hear your enthusiasm in your voice with your presentation. You obviously enjoy your work. And I just wanted to make it clear that in the backcountry land plan, Charlie was working as a National Park Service employee at that time. And it's my understanding that Charlie wrote those standards. Now, Charlie, you can correct me if I'm wrong.
You're on mute.
Sorry, I was on mute. Shannon and I collaborated on them, so he had an awful lot of influence because he knew what he was doing and I didn't. Let me Steve Carwiles typed a question here in the chat. Did the NPS and concession flight map show helicopter flights in the preserve high power area monitoring fires? So wondering if that's maybe where
out here. Yeah, that's a good question. I would have to look at the actual mission code for that. For our Park Service flights, we actually know kind of what people were doing to. I don't know, Steve. It could be fires, it could be wildlife work, or something else. So,
okay. And then Paul asked, when you say you can hear a source noise at 10 kilometers, what is the decibels of the source noise and what is the resulting decibels at a distance of 10 kilometers?
well, that's a very insightful question. And if I can give a general answer, as a physicist, I love general answers because you can extrapolate more from them first. And then a more precise example is that, the definition of an active space is that, essentially this source is above ambience. So the boundary of the active space is equivalent to whatever the ambient level is. The source is essentially maybe you're looking like we looked at that propeller tone early on the spectrogram where a lot of the energy was at 80 hertz. Maybe we're thinking about it in terms of 80 hertz, like, whatever it, comparing ambient at 80 hertz to that propeller tone at 80 hertz, at the boundary of the active space, they're equal. There's essentially that's the definition of it. But I guess the more specific answer is that a lot of times what we're talking about is we're hearing aircraft down to, 20, 30 dB. There's some reason to believe, there's good reason to believe actually that levels as low as 35, there's well-documented evidence in the literature of wildlife literature that, that's when mammal cortisol stress response kicks in. It's the standard people use for classrooms and for sleep disturbance in cities. So 35 dB is, it's strange because there are a lot of natural environments where we would pick, put a tent and you'd be camping in 35 dB with like the sound of the river. But you may actually, I don't know you all, but I've had some weird situations where the river's rising at night and you can actually hear boulders clicking and moving. It's a little stressful, but the point is that, these sound levels, we do measure and detect them down to very low levels indeed.
Thanks, David. Next question from Patricia or Pat. Do you think the shift to electric engines will affect noise? She says she was recently in a park in the lower 48 and was thinking something was strange, realized it was lack of aircraft noise. That here in Alaska, we sometimes do associate aircraft noise with wilderness.
That's a great question, Patricia. I'm so glad you asked this. This has been fabulous question so far. So that's actually one of the things I'm most optimistic about in the future. I think the future could be quite a bit quieter. There are now experimental electric aircraft that are in existence. And I think in many places, most parks in the system are dominated by road noise. And so, there could just be incredible benefits to parks in terms of electric vehicle use. I haven't studied, of course, the other drawbacks nearly as much, but as someone interested in noise, that's very, I find that very optimistic.
I'm reminded of a conversation I once had with Chip Dennerlein, the former, former regional director in Alaska for National Parks Conservation Association, and talking about this issue of planes being a part of the wilderness experience here. And he said, if I'm out in the backcountry and I hear a plane go over, the first thought is like, where are they going? Off to some other kind of interesting destination or whatever. But then a second or a third one goes by, and eventually it's traffic. You're in traffic in the wilderness, aircraft traffic. And so there is a distinction somewhere in there between a level of wilderness use aircraft and, being in traffic.
I think as well, Charlie, to add to what you're saying, yes, and I think there are some legal distinctions. ANILCA provides for access for traditional use. So general aviators can land their aircraft, for instance, wherever they want. ANILCA doesn't say anything about commercial use.
Well, it does say some things about commercial use, but I understand what you're saying. Yes, yes.
Yeah.
Let me move on to Paul's next question here. Do you have data in Denali Park of the decibels at the NPS gravel pits along the park road? And do you have data on how far away you can hear the sound from those NPS gravel pits?
Okay, great. Another good question, Paul. This one I actually don't have that much. Some of the best information on the tech pit, for instance, dates back to Shan's era. He was some of the things that he was measuring back then. Mach 5 pit, I think he's got some data from there, tech pit. So we've got it. I haven't looked at it for a long time. I guess I would say that I work on construction noise a lot in my job these days. I'm called in on almost every big EIS or EA I'm the only acoustician that I know of in Alaska at all, in the private sector, public sector, so I end up working on everything. Pebble Mine, the coastal plain EIS, you name it, Ambler Road. So I end up doing quite a bit of rule of thumb type measures of these sorts of construction impacts. I'm always looking for better information on it. Pile drivers, reversing alarms, backup beepers, just you name it, like all sorts of these different types of noise. The truth is that they vary quite a bit depending on what you're doing. And so rule of thumb kind of works pretty well. We have a tool that I use a lot on the job. It's called attenuation calculator. It's just like a simple rule of thumb idea of how far that noise might spread out. So if you have a specific question or concern, something, that the Park Service is capable of anyways.
All right. Question from Steve here, which Nancy sort of replied to. I think you might benefit from a longer answer. Was it the Aircraft Overflights Committee? I'm going to interpret a little bit from what Steve wrote here. The Aircraft Overflights Advisory Committee recommendation that flight seeing to the mountain be routed over the backcountry and away from the road corridor. Because it seems that those riding the bus seem to bring their own noise with them. So what's the benefit of routing aircraft noise away from the road corridor?
So this one, Nancy, I'm going to have to disagree with you here. We've been telling people that essentially to try to fly over the road corridor if possible. So that essentially these experiences of solitude that people are really seeking and really care about are the ones that are more remote. Certainly I've been telling people that over the last decade. So if I don't know, maybe I've got a mixed message, but truthfully, I think the people most likely to benefit from these kinds of actions are the ones who are traveling further into the backcountry areas, overnight trips. We'd love to.
Yeah, we suggested that we had a specific route that was south of the crest that we would suggested that planes would fly if weather was permitted.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So it wasn't over the high backcountry. It was south of the crest because the people in the high backcountry would hear flights coming directly over them and also diverting a bit north. So those were the recommendations, knowing that there's somebody that's going to be affected. And it was just the sheer number of overflights that was an issue. And in addition, the overflights from Talkeetna, how they circled the mountain and how they returned would be significant as well.
Thanks for the clarification.
Yes, and so that pink area on the map that's actually on the screen right now shows where it was. I believe that they were recommending that the flights from the north side go. Is that right? Yeah.
Right.
It obviously doesn't. We aren't talking about the majority of flights that originate in Talkeetna.
And if you're interested in those best practices, you want to read up on them. They're quite old now. They're about a decade old, and I'm really hoping we can get a new round of those in the decade to come. But the third link that Nancy shared there, Nancy shared a bunch of links that I encourage you to explore if you want to learn more. But the third one, Denali Air Tour Operators Best Practices to Minimize Sound Impacts, it lists all those in great detail.
And those are up at the top of the chat if you've been scrolling down with the questions. Russell asked, probably gets to the question that a lot of people are on the on the call to hear about, but are there any actual enforcement mechanisms on the horizon to regulate aircraft noise at Denali?
Well, that's actually a great question. And the truth is, I think I can answer that affirmatively. There's in the lower 48 right now, folks probably know about, or maybe they don't. Certainly in my world, one of the most well-known laws is the National Parks Air Tour Management Plan Act, NAPATMA. And right now, we recently were, the Park Service and the FAA was sued. And essentially, we're working out the process there. The judge issued a writ of mandamus, which essentially we had to act and publish these plans. And there was a 2-year timeline, and they're sticking to those. They're coming out as we speak, and they range from anywhere from, none of them increase the number of overflights. Some of them reduce the number of overflights, and some of them are going to completely eliminate overflights over these parks. Of course, we were accepted from that law in Alaska by our congressional delegation. But I will say that the one thing we aren't exempted from pursuing are voluntary agreements. So a voluntary agreement is basically the director of the Park Service and the administrator of the FAA would codify something and get essentially these, it's a small number of people. And luckily, the best part about the situation we've got here in Denali right now is that these are all still locally owned businesses. I mean, we know these people, they're in our communities as well. They're not like our enemies or part of some huge giant corporation or something, and so it's possible that we could work out a voluntary agreement. And certainly the best practices that we've already established are like that, but this would be a way of articulating that in a more formal fashion. So voluntary agreements.
Yeah, so those are possible, but I suspect there are no actual active discussions with anyone on that right now.
No.
Yeah, it's just the thing that could be done as a next step. And I know DCC at times has suggested that that the Aircraft Overflights Advisory Committee should have become a permanent standing advisory committee to work out these issues and sort of aim for continuous improvement in terms of the noise impacts in the backcountry. But I think folks further up the bureaucratic food chain didn't want to keep paying for it. It was my impression after its initial charter ran out. Paul asked, your list of toolbox solutions included management of commercial activities that cause noise. Does that include National Park Service activities, since that was not included in the list?
Yes, I mean, already the Park Service uses quite a bit of aviation to get various projects done. And I help advocate to the best of my abilities to try to keep that to a minimum, and that we really are using our minimum required tool to get work done. And a lot of times that isn't a helicopter, So the answer to that is yes. All in all, I would like to just encourage you to scan this again and take a look at this. Probably the percentage of Park Service flights is less than 5. So still an important contribution, but commercial use is the problem.
Gotcha. Yeah, that certainly makes sense. But do appreciate, I know the Park Service does work to minimize flights. And thanks for your role in doing that. Because for those of us trying to find quiet in the backcountry, every flight that doesn't go as your data shows, there's conceivably a lot of people who then don't have to hear it.
Right. The areas that I will say, to kind of temper my own statement just there, the areas where the Park Service is operating are areas which would otherwise have almost no noise at all. So some of our impacts can be differentially great in that sense.
So I don't see any other questions right now. I do wanted to maybe we'll start moving toward winding up, but I did want to kind of have a final thought I wanted you to reflect on. But a lot of the park the wilderness core of the park is zoned for very low amounts of noise. And, you know, the thought was, well, this is the designated wilderness. Shouldn't it have the most wilderness characteristics of anywhere in the park? And I find myself kind of horrified by like that data from Triple Lakes Trail, where, I mean, Triple Lakes is in the wilderness. But is how, you know, and it's noisy, it's like really noisy there, which anyone who's walked there knows. I mean, there's a lot of aircraft traffic going by, and I don't know if these were in audible range of the Parks Highway 2 or not.
Only in the very, very like 2-3 a.m. those big trucks going by late at night.
Yeah.
Anyways, please continue.
Yes. Anyway, so what I wanted you to reflect on for a moment, maybe, and then Barbara has put another thing in the chat, which I'll have you reflect on after this one. But how do we distinguish? You know, I guess, is there any movement or thought within the soundscape community for saying, well, this part of wilderness is more deserving of quiet than some other part of wilderness? Or is there some kind of absolute wilderness standard we should all be shooting for in terms of noise in our wilderness areas?
Well, it's a rich question. There's a lot of ways to answer it. The level of 35 dB that I mentioned before, that's starting to crystallize as a level somewhere between 35 and 40 dB is crystallizing as an example of where there probably are real functional effects of noise. There are others. I listed that 52 dB, and our recommendation for the front country area is going to be around 55 for that area. So, like, you know, kind of depending on the context. You asked about wilderness, I'll nip that whole front country thing in right now. But the other thing I would say is, like, how do you can think about the values. Like, I kind of alluded to this on that last slide about the long range transportation plan. I'm almost tempted to pull it up right now and just show you the rationales that I was using in that document. There's a list of them, and they're kind of all lined out, but essentially things like ambient level, you know, like places that are generally more energetic. Like, so the extreme southwest part of the park has got some real steep mountains with some really powerful, like, large snowpack and stuff, and they just got more ambience. Noise is not going to be nearly audible at as great a distance, and it's not going to be as impactful there because you can't hear it. But there's other reasons too, you know, like we've already kind of grappled with them a little bit. So do you value travel time from an access portal over a more proximal experience close to the road corridor? That's a judgment that I don't think science is going to inform, right? Like, that's something to talk about and discuss with people in a context where you're actually going to, like, think about your values, or why would this matter more than something else? There's a lot of different ways. Do you keep noise where it already is, or do you spread it out? You know, that's another possibility. And I hope I'm not waffling too much, but essentially those kind of questions, I do think that they would be illuminated with a facilitated discussion, somebody who's an expert in the way that sound works, someone like myself or others who understand it, and people who just, like, have deeply held convictions about the value of where is noise more impactful than others. Is campgrounds more important, or, you know, things like that.
Well, and actually this kind of leads into what Barb's question was. So maybe we'll continue this, but
okay.
There's, you know, she makes the point that, you know, isn't the greater overall ecosystem as important as visitor experiences? She was referring specifically to the pink area, but really you could take this to anywhere. Even if visitors don't hear it, they are affected by an ecosystem that's impacted by noise. And it kind of brings that sort of essentialist question, you know, when you're talking about any other natural resource, you know, if it's damaged, we care that it's damaged, even if, you know, you don't necessarily know, you know, personally know that it's missed. But why is it that with sound we can talk about you know, gradations of that? And isn't there, I guess it's the old question, if, if a tree falls in a forest and no one's there to hear it, does it make a sound? But,
Yes.
if the sound environment's changed in a part of the park where no one's on the ground, doesn't it still matter? Isn't there some quality to wilderness that we want to be out there, even if no one is maybe in that space at that moment?
Yes, my answer to both the question about the tree falling and your sort of assertion beyond it is yes. One of the things I love about this job is that ears unify us as animals. It's like every animal has got a sense of hearing. There are blind animals. Those of us who are privileged to have good hearing, I should say too. That's to be more fair and not ableist. They're essentially like hearing, the noise matters, like the ecological fragmentation. There's so many effects that have been shown, and the literature is just growing year by year on the effects of noise on wildlife. A lot of them have shifted to these long-term energetic fitness type things and the fragmentation of habitats. So I think it matters very much that the noise is present where people aren't. All
right. Well, someone else, let me see if we can do this. Yes. That Nancy was just putting in the chat for access to David's presentations and links. If you cannot grab them here, you send an email to dcc@denalicitizens.org. I'd also like to point out that the park does have a tool on their program webpage, which you can get to from the post about this program on David's. If you go to the Denali Citizens Council webpage and look at the post on Denali Soundscapes, you can get a link straight to that program webpage. But there's a map there where you can go up and explore.
There you go. I was supposed to show this in the talk, Charlie. I totally blanked on it.
Dave's going to show it really quickly.
Really quickly, yeah. Oh my goodness, that's really embarrassing. But you can. There's a lot of different sizes we measured all over the state. This is, if you just type Denali Soundscapes into a browser of your choice, this will be the top hit, and it's a great tool. I got some help from one of my farmer technicians on this. Okay, so for instance, we were looking at that Bull River, for instance. Here's a picture of the site. We get a little bit of information about where it was. Some statistics about, I'm not going to go in the text, but basically the core stuff on the backcountry management plan standards is here. It gives you a link back to the plan itself, and it also tells you the exceedance. This is always the most recent deployment that you're looking at. So this is an automated thing we've got now. So when I get done with analysis, it just gets, every once in a while I'll update this. And the ones here with the red involve, they also have a sound clip you can listen to. These are some of my favorite sounds. They're really the cream of the crop type sounds. And I've also shared, they all are drawn from a gallery that I've been curating, and you can explore that. That's in the links that Nancy shared, that you can go in and find those from all different parks, including these and more. Just beautiful sounds, if that's more of your speed.
Perfect. Thank you. That is great. So anyone who did not get enough of Soundscapes tonight and wants to see and hear, in the cases of the ones in red, what the sound environment is like all over the park, definitely check out this webpage. And David, thank you so much for all your
Paul has
Charlie?
his hand up. Maybe
I think Paul has his hand up.
Or it's up for a reason.
Sure.
Yeah.
Paul, do you want to unmute? Was there something you wanted to ask right away or quickly?
Yeah, I think I'm unmuted. And I'll have a longer conversation with David and all the mathematical equations later. We can talk in person, but I wanted to ask some questions specifically so that everyone on this call does not go away with the wrong information. So I need to ask David the following questions. And specifically, I don't want everybody on this call to go away saying, oh, if there's a noise in the park, I can hear it 6 miles away. So David, I need to ask you, you gave an example where an aircraft engine with energy of, I think 60 hertz could be heard 6 miles away.
Okay.
Well, that aircraft engine has an energy, and the more power or the more energy of that, yes, the farther away you're going to hear that sound. But what decibel is that aircraft engine you're describing that can be heard 6 miles away? It's
Well,
much more.
I've already answered your question. So it's above ambient level. It would be 20 to 30 dB, something like that. And actually, you can hear them. The typical distance is 10 kilometers. 10 kilometers away,
Yeah,
and sometimes up to 20.
Yeah, 10 kilometers, 6 miles. Yeah, okay. And I understand you said that what you're hearing, that distance, 10 kilometers, you're hearing ambient decibels, and I understand that, 20 decibels. But the source of that engine, was it 80 decibel, or do you know the source of that engine that you're saying can be heard 6 miles away? To 10
Various,
kilometers?
like different aircraft, depending on their size and their capacity and stuff like this, Paul, they vary a little bit, but so we use a different metric, and I'm almost a little bit loath to bring it up right now, but it's
Okay.
sound power level. But it's kind of like it's like a light bulb. The analogy is to a light bulb. If you have a light bulb and you know its wattage, it's its power, right? How much power it emits. And so if you say you had a way of going all the way around the plane and measuring up the total amount of energy that plane was kicking out, that's its power level. And basically, the short story is that power level ranges for small aircraft, it's about 110 dB sound power level. That's the total output of the aircraft, to anywhere up to about 140 or more. Some of these really powerful military aircraft are far exceed that. But these levels, that's essentially sound spreads out without any other information about it. It spreads out like a sphere. From an aircraft source. A lot of aircraft are really directional. Jets are a perfect example of that. Like these, commercial airliners we fly on are really directional. But most functioning aircraft are pretty generally kind of a sphere when they radiate out.
Sure.
But
Okay.
does that answer your question?
Yeah, very, very much so. Specifically the 110 to 140 decibels, because what I want to relate to everybody on this call is that if I'm running my pickup truck, or if I'm running a diesel generator at 80 decibels, well, that's not an aircraft engine. So if I'm running my generator at 80 decibels, you're not going to hear that 10 kilometers away or, 6 miles away. You run the equation, you're going to hear that a lot. It's going to go down to ambient, within less than 2 miles maybe, but, we can run the equations. But
Yes.
the other clarification I want to make on your 10 kilometers or 6, which is 6 miles, is that certainly that's line of sight, correct? In other words, if I can see that airplane 10 kilometers away, I might be able to hear it because, the noise is not quite down to ambient noise. I might be able to hear it if I can see it line of sight. But certainly if it's on the other side of a mountain ridge, or on the other side of Denali, if that airplane is taken off from Ruth Amphitheater and I'm on the other side of Denali, down on the Muddy River, I'm within 10 kilometers, but I'm not going to hear that airplane, correct?
Correct. Yes. And a very insightful. Yep. So
Okay.
terrain shielding, especially at low levels like we're experiencing in parks, is really important. There's other things
Right.
as well, which I'm not going to go into right now, but this tool that I've been using, it incorporates some of our best physics available. It's far cry from what I wish we had, but it's using a lot of different atmospheric properties and things like this, terrain, interactions of sound, like reflections off the ground and stuff like this. And it's kind of been fun to learn the physics about it. And yes, you're totally right.
Okay. Yeah, no, that's important. If there's a mountain in the way, you're not going to hear that sound. And I guess for future discussions, all of this has been really interesting, but it seemed like a lot of what we focused on was the loudest noises with the most energy. These aircraft engines that are 110 to 140 decibels, 80 hertz energy, very powerful, very loud.
Very extensive. Very
Yes.
extensive. They influence the most of the park. They're the most important source of the noise in the backcountry.
And that's probably why you study them extensively and why, most of the data is on them. I understand that. But I would also like to have future discussions about, well, how about a lodge running a generator? Or how about a bus that's rumbling down the road, these gasoline buses or diesel buses. They also emit noise, and that noise can be heard a certain distance, can't be heard 10 kilometers, 6 miles. You can't hear it that far away. But, certainly from anybody within the vicinity, they emit noise, and, how much of that, noise pollution is either affecting the wildlife or affecting day hikers. So it's kind of my comment.
Thank you.
So I'll go offline. Thanks.
Yes, and I would add to that one of the and I do know, and we need to wind up, so we can't open a whole new branch of discussion now. But I know the Park Service and David have actually gathered data near the park road too, and do have some information about the amount that kind of road traffic and other kinds of noise other than aircraft have. One of the real instigations for the sound standards in the backcountry plan not only had to do with aircraft, but also snow machines in the places in the park where snow machines are used. And it was envisioned that this be a major tool in figuring out how we might be able to manage that snow machine use better. And it's one of the it's the part of the backcountry management plan which has been implemented the least. I think, because I don't think anything's been done with that, though I do know you also have some winter measurements from areas where snow machine use is common.
It's an interesting comment, Charlie. I have a project in where I'd like to get some more collaborative, like VRP Ranger resources, kind of dual collaborative type monitoring scenarios in the winter. Hasn't taken. I haven't seen anyone really show much interest in it. So maybe it's time to revisit that conversation too.
All right. Well, meanwhile, I really do think we should let you go now. It's been, we've had you for an hour and a half. Very much appreciate all the time and expertise you brought to this conversation, as well as to what you bring to your work at the park just any given day. For all of you listening who are DCC members or would like to be, our next major event is going to be our annual meeting, June 4th. We're going to do it live this year at Tonglin Lake Lodge. Put it on your calendars. Look for announcements with details soon. June 4th there at Tonglin Lake. And with that, I'm going to wrap it up. Thanks so much, everyone, for coming. And David, in particular to you for coming and sharing all this with us.
Good evening.
All right.
Thank you, David.